Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be drifting through space, knowing you might never make it back? This was the terrifying reality faced by the crew of Apollo 13 in April 1970. What started as a routine space mission quickly turned into a fight for survival, thousands of kilometers away from Earth. This is the gripping story of Apollo 13, a mission that was meant to make history by landing on the moon but ended up capturing the world's attention for a very different reason. On April 11, 1970, a rocket carrying 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert, blasted off from Kennedy Space Center. They were headed for the Framaro crater on the moon, an area believed to hold clues about the moon's history and, by extension, Earth's own origin. It had been less than a year since Neil Armstrong had first set foot on the lunar surface, and this was NASA's 3rd mission aimed at exploring the moon. By all accounts, Apollo 13 seemed like another routine mission. The astronauts aboard were confident. After all, they were following the success of 2 previous moon landings. And why shouldn't they be? The spacecraft design was familiar, just like the ones that had worked flawlessly before. Yet, they had no idea that in just a matter of days, their lives would hang in the balance. For the first 2 days of the mission, everything went smoothly. There was little to worry about. And in fact, the astronauts even found time to joke around. Jack Swigert, for example, realized mid-flight that he had forgotten to file his income tax return, causing some light-hearted moments. But everything changed on the 3rd day of the mission, April 13, 1970. The crew was told to carry out some routine tests, including a check on the spacecraft's oxygen tanks. What seemed like a simple task quickly became a nightmare. Suddenly, the astronauts heard a loud bang. The spacecraft shook violently, and alarms began to blare. "Houston, we've had a problem here," Jack Swigert famously reported back to Mission Control. A massive explosion had ripped through one of their oxygen tanks, and the second tank was rapidly leaking. The spacecraft was drifting off course, and the astronauts were now farther from Earth than any human had ever been before, a record that still stands today. The dream of landing on the moon was shattered. Now, the question was whether they could even return to Earth alive. The explosion had caused severe damage to the spacecraft's service module. Oxygen was leaking into space, and the astronauts were losing their ability to generate power. Mission Control initially thought it was a glitch with their instruments, but the crew could see it was much worse. They were venting precious oxygen into space. With both oxygen and electrical power at risk, the mission quickly shifted from exploration to survival. As news of the explosion spread, television networks that had initially deemed the mission too routine to cover began broadcasting updates. Suddenly, the entire world was glued to their screens, watching as NASA scrambled to come up with a plan to save the astronauts. The Apollo 13 spacecraft had 4 main components: the command module, where the astronauts spent most of their time; the service module, which housed the oxygen tanks, fuel cells, and other critical systems; the lunar module, designed to land on the moon; and a launch escape system that had been jettisoned earlier after a successful takeoff. With the service module now severely damaged, the astronauts were forced to shut down the command module to conserve power and rely on the lunar module as a lifeboat. But the lunar module had its own limitations. It was designed to support 2 astronauts for just a couple of days while they explored the moon, not to house 3 men for the long journey back to Earth. On top of that, it didn't have the power to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. The astronauts had to figure out how to stretch its resources, oxygen, water, and electricity, far beyond their intended limits. The plan was risky. The crew would have to loop around the moon and use its gravity to slingshot them back towards Earth. This longer route would take them several days to complete, but it avoided the risk of trying to fire the damaged service module's main engine. However, the question remained: did they have enough supplies to survive? With oxygen and power dwindling, NASA faced another life-threatening problem: carbon dioxide buildup. The lunar module's carbon dioxide scrubbers weren't equipped to handle the amount of CO2 that 3 astronauts were producing. The filters from the command module could help, but there was a catch. They were square, and the lunar module scrubbers were round. In an extraordinary feat of ingenuity, NASA engineers on the ground worked with the astronauts to fashion a makeshift adapter using plastic bags, cardboard, and duct tape. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, keeping the crew alive as they continued their journey home. Even though the immediate crisis had been managed, the astronauts were far from safe. Temperatures inside the spacecraft plummeted as the crew was forced to conserve every ounce of energy. They huddled together in the freezing cold, rationing water and food. The stress and deprivation took its toll. Fred Haise developed a urinary tract infection, and all 3 men lost weight due to dehydration and lack of nutrition. Yet, despite everything, they remained focused on the goal: getting home. As the spacecraft neared Earth, the astronauts faced one final challenge. The lunar module wasn't designed for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Before re-entering, the crew had to power up the command module, something they had shut down days ago. But would it still work after being frozen for so long? Would the heat shield, damaged by the explosion, hold up as they plummeted through the atmosphere at blistering speeds? The world held its breath as Apollo 13 made its final approach. After what felt like an eternity, radio contact was re-established, and the astronauts safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. Against all odds, they had survived. The Apollo 13 mission, which was meant to land humans on the moon, became a defining moment in space history for a different reason. It demonstrated the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the power of teamwork and ingenuity. The astronauts, with the help of NASA's engineers, turned a near-certain disaster into one of the most remarkable survival stories of our time. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.